Hi, this is Amy Austin, and welcome to episode 40 of A Time to Thrill. I'm sorry, I'm laughing because actually what I'm thinking about is I want to say, hi, and welcome to The Murders Began. This is your host, Blake Hardin-Tatum, because I have been trying to figure out how to best format the podcast episodes in the upcoming book, The Murders Began, which is out February 8, 2024. And I've been thinking about it for 2 days, and I had to add intros and outros to her podcast. And so in my head now, it's Welcome to The Murders Began with Blake Hardin-Tatum. This week, we're going to talk about Tia Wetzel. With the new book. So Blake Hardin-Tatum, who you were introduced to in Without Consent, I'm not even sure if she was in an older title, who knows, is a podcaster, and her podcast is called The Murders Began. And I'm not sure, it's because I listen to podcasts for almost 10 years, or because I have a podcast, or I don't know what it is, but I'm sort of obsessed with the idea of podcasts. Although, outside of Serial and one other podcast, about this murder in Minnesota, I have not been a true crime podcast fan. I mainly listen to, actually my favorite podcast, I will tell you, is The Honeydew with Ryan Sickler. And before that, he had a different podcast with The Honeydew's like maybe 3 years old. But before that, he had a podcast called The Crab Feast, which ran for 7 years, and I never missed a single episode. It came out on Tuesdays. There was a huge joke on the show, and he interviews comedians, mostly comedians, a couple of other random celebrities, but mostly comedians who have sort of tragic life stories. So it's a storytelling podcast. So the Crab Feast, which I was introduced to at the podcast festival at UCLA so many years ago, it's a storytelling podcast, and he really focuses on these stories of people's lives, like how they grew up, where they grew up. And I don't know, let me say this, like 95% of them are like both hilarious and tragic. So if you I'm trying to think, Ms. Pat was one that was really hilarious and tragic. Some of them are just so amazing. There was one a couple months ago that was amazing. I don't know if this is because I kind of share a similar background, but if you have a background that's full of abject insanity, but you're also successful as a creator, I am all ready for your story. That said, I did listen to Serial, the first one. I'm not sure I listened to the second one. And then that one in Minnesota, which I will look up and put in the show notes. But they, the true crime podcasts, I find kind of interesting, but really, I don't know how to say this, aren't my thing. Maybe because I write about crime, or because I had a job as a defense attorney dealing with crime. It's not how I seek out entertainment, although I do read books about crime. It's the true crime. Maybe it's the true nature of it. If it's fiction, then you can do outrageous things and people can have outrageous things happen to them. But when you throw in that truth, it goes from outrageous and entertaining to just tragic and sad, and makes me feel horrible about the justice system and missed justice and lack of police expertise in solving crimes, and I go down this road. All that said, my character, Blake Hardin-Tatum, gets laid off from the plane dealer, which was a huge issue. I'm sure if you live in this world, newspapers, when I was growing up, were king, and now they're not. And the massive rounds of layoffs to even people who are unionized in the last, 30 years has been something else. And all those journalists, didn't die and go away. So a lot of them started podcasts or started blogs, and then ended up working for online publications, but they really had to morph and change with the changing times. So Blake Hardin-Tatum is sort of in this space where she gets laid off, not one of the first rounds, but the staff gets smaller and smaller and your salary becomes higher and higher, you're much more likely to be laid off. So she gets laid off, and she has to figure out what else to do. And as a crime reporter, she is at the beginning of the whole true crime thing. Since the book's written in the past, I believe this book takes place in 2009 and 2010, just when podcasts were starting and it was not easy, I don't want to say this, but a podcast could really take off because it was a new medium. Started with Apple and the iPhones, a new medium for people to take in entertainment. And it was much more democratic in that you could start a podcast and have an audience where, without gatekeepers, without TV producers or movie producers or any entertainment people who love to gatekeep. So I really loved that era. I remember driving around listening to podcasts. Like I remember buying a car, maybe in I bought a first car when I moved here in 2001, but I bought another car, and we're at the dealership, and the guy's like, "What's important for you in the car?" And I'm like, "What's really important for me in the car is I can plug in my phone and I can listen to podcasts." The guy looked at me like I was so strange, but it was really important to me, and that car and every subsequent car, I've certainly been able to do that. And that early era, like 2010, 11, 12, I remember driving around. My son was really little, and I had to drive from place to place for child entertainment, and I would listen to podcasts, and they're actually great to listen to at night. It sort of takes the place of talk radio, which really dominated my youth. There was a network called TalkNet, and they would have like advice people, money people, relationship people, sorts of different people who would talk at night and have people on. And it is the way I went to sleep as a child. So as an adult, there's something very familiar and comforting about listening to advice or interviews or like true stories. So Blake Hardin Tatum sort of walks into this space, after being laid off, and she starts this podcast, The Murders Begin. I'm not sure. I don't believe there were any episodes that were featured in Without Consent. She was there, and her podcast was nascent, but now I'm sort of including them in. So if you've read a book, I've just read a book called Dark Corners, and then the previous book, I can't think of the name of it, by an author named Megan Golden, and maybe a few years ago. And she is a true crime podcaster, and I sort of love it. Like, I really love that element of realism being injected into crime fiction these days. Maybe there are more. If there are more, email me, let me know. But I'm trying to think. Haven't read a lot of books that include podcasters, and I'm reading all the time, but who knows? So I'm really excited about that, and I've just veered off. Okay, so on this episode, I am speaking with New York Times bestselling author Debra Holland. So we talk about this during the podcast, so I will not retread over this. But I met her some years ago, and she was one of the first authors I knew in Southern California to sort of take the reins and run with indie publishing. And she has done amazingly well. But she was really bold. And I remember meeting her, and I was like, I can't believe you're boldly doing this. And I was still messing around with publishers, big and small. And she was so so I went down to these meetings, and she was so accepting, and she shared all this knowledge, and she really encouraged me in a number of ways to take the reins of my own career. And I'm forever grateful to her for this. And I told her this either on the podcast or off, I'm not sure. But she's one of the people that changed my life. There's so many women that I have met who have offered a hand down with information, knowledge, all these things that emboldened me and gave me the confidence to take the reins of my own career. So Debra Holland writes clean, or I don't know, clean. I don't like the word of that. That implies the opposite is dirty. She writes romance with no sex, sometimes kissing. We've had these conversations over the years, and has done incredibly well in that space. A lot of Western romance. She has a whole series set in Montana, and we talk about that on the podcast, and also some paranormal fiction. And she's just a lovely woman who has an amazing, I don't know, like writing's her main job now, an amazing side hustle, which we'll talk about. She has a PhD and um, she does counseling, and you'll hear more about that. Um, it's she keeps her hand in it, and it's just one of the most amazing sort of jobs to have in addition to writing, dealing with like people's tragedies and helping them through that. And then on the other hand, writing super hopeful fiction. It's just an amazing combination. And I got to see your cat on video. I can't share that with you because I don't do video podcasts. But I got to see your cat, and it was great speaking with her. And I hope you'll enjoy this interview. It's amazingly in-depth conversation. It's insightful. It's why I started this podcast. I normally have these conversations with these very smart, accomplished women at writing meetings or these writing retreats, and she and I last went to a retreat in Italy in 2019. Oh, I may post a picture if I find one. And it is just great to have these conversations in my life, and I really treasure and value having these people in my life. But it's also spectacular that I get to share these kinds of conversations with you. So without further ado, let's speak with New York Times bestselling author Debra Holland. Hi, and welcome to A Time to Thrill. It's me, your host, Amy Austin. Today, I am talking with New York Times bestselling author Debra Holland. Hi, Debra.
Hello.
How are you?
Good. You're talking to me and to my cat, Lovey.
I know. I just saw your cat. I grew up with cats. We always had more than one, which is a whole different conversation. But pets are the best. Anyway, so how are you? So I haven't seen you in almost 4 years. Oh my God, 4 years. We were just saying, I just saw you in 2019 in Italy at a writer's retreat.
Yes, which was tremendous fun.
It was. We went to dinner. I think it was the best. So I have so many questions that I've always wanted to ask. But first, I want to give you a sincere thank you. I don't know if you remember this, but maybe like May of 2014 or 2015, it's way back, you had been producing audiobooks, and you were encouraging the rest of us to produce audiobooks. And I was like, I don't have any time for this. And so we stood in the parking lot, I don't know how long, and you're like, you really should do this. This is the time. I don't know what I need to say to you, but you really need to do this. And I took it to heart, and I went home, more or less, and immediately hired a narrator and did my first audiobook. And it was, that first experience was actually delightful. The book, I remember having the book up on Audible, and it paid for itself, I swear to God, in the first week. And I remember calling Beth, Beth Yarnell. I remember calling Beth, and I was like, who are these people buying this book, and how did this thing pay for itself, and how did I not know this? And then immediately after that, I put, I don't know, maybe I've not done all of them, maybe 14 or 15 other books in audiobook, but you were the catalyst, and I want to thank you for that.
You're very welcome. I think I wasn't an early adopter of audiobooks. I started in 2013, and my self-published books, I self-published them in April of 2011, the first two anyway. So it wasn't until ACX, Audible Creation Exchange came to me and said, we'll pay for you to do an audiobook. And I'm like, great. And I'm like, oh, now what do I do? And then luckily I was part of a small group, the group of authors that I founded Club Indie with on Facebook.
Right.
And so Amazon invited us to Seattle, and they literally had us meet with all the different departments because they wanted our feedback about what was working and what was needed for. And so ACX was there, and she was doing a Zoom-ish kind of presentation, and she sort of said, okay, this is what you do. And she took us through all the steps to sign up to do the audiobook. And I was like following along going, oh, I can do that.
Right.
I'm like the technophobe. It's like, oh, it's so overwhelming. And even though I knew I should because it was like the new thing and I'd just been dragging my heels. And then I was like, oh, okay. And then one of my friends who was there also said, here, use my narrator. And I'm like, okay, I'm all set now. And luckily, so I called him and he was like, yeah. And he goes, I told him I was like this total newbie knowing nothing. And he was like, okay, don't worry about it. I got this. I'll take you through it. So it was a wonderful experience. And I think it's also one of the huge lessons of all the people who are listening to this, who are writers, is to find a community, because I owe where I am to all the people who have helped me along the way. And like you said, like you owe this sort of audiobook stuff to me. And I'm a very big believer in paying back and helping everybody. Why you were hearing me say, do audiobooks. And if you go back a few years, you would have heard me say, do ebooks, do self-publishing.
Right.
I was really an early adopter, not as early as I wish I had been, but early enough to go, this is working. And let me tell everybody about this because so many people don't know. And so people will help you and you help people. And it's a wonderful profession in that respect.
It really is. You have no idea, because if you had not, I don't know how long you were in the parking lot, because I don't know why I was so resistant, but that's a different conversation. I don't know if you hadn't talked to me that day. I remember because I think I had gone away. I got on a plane right after that, but I did hire the narrator. And he did it over the summer. And I remember listening to it in my apartment in Budapest. I don't know if I would have done it or if I would have waited 10 years. I mean, I just can't say, but I'm so grateful that I listened. And it wasn't so resistant that I didn't listen. I mean, I only tried one book first and did it. And I have zero regrets about it, like zero regrets. I will say that nobody told me how weird it was going to be to have your book read to you. Like that was the oddest thing. It felt oddly uncomfortable. Like, oh, this is kind of uncomfortable. But other than that, I am eternally grateful for that. And you were one of the early. So one of the things, so you know that I live in LA and you live in Orange County, but one of the reasons that I spent a lot of time at the Orange County, at the time, our Romance Writers Association, was that you were very, very, very welcoming to new authors. I don't know if I signed up by then, if I published a book, I can't say that. But also like the new trends. I think other chapters were a little bit more resistant. Ebooks aren't going to be a thing and don't waste your time and all of that. So I'm a much later adopter to self-publishing, but it was lovely to have people say, you can do this. I don't want to say any way you want, but you can do this in many ways and be successful in many ways and still be embraced, I think is the word I want. And so for that, I will always, always appreciate Orange County. I got in my car and I drove. I'm not a driver. I'm from New York City, but I got in my car and, drove that, from LA to Orange County, like that once a month. And it was so sort of heartwarming to have people embrace whatever the thing was that you were doing. And for me, it wasn't that complicated. I mean, I was just writing traditionally like romance back then, but, letting go of my not great publisher and having the confidence to self-publish, I do owe to all of you down there who were really encouraging. Because I was like, I was sitting there crying going, well, if I let go of my publisher, then who will I be? Like, I couldn't figure that out. But it was sort of helpful to get that.
Well, the reason I will not take 100% credit, which will sound like it when I'm telling my story, but part of it is it's just a great group of people. But I was the first self-published author. But this is 2011, but I had been a member since 98. So I had gone to almost every meeting and I had volunteered. I had been a speaker because I'm also a psychotherapist. So
Mhm.
I taught a class on, the male point of view and understanding men. So I had done a lot. People knew me. People, helped a lot of people in many ways. And so people knew me, people respected me, people liked me. So when I come in and I'm like, it's my, I think, second week or second month
Mhm.
of self-publishing, and I have the cover of Wild Montana Sky on my phone, and I'm literally running around. And I was so excited because by this time I'd sold 44 books.
Right.
I published on the 28th of April. So like 2.5 weeks later, when it's time for our meeting, and I'm running around going, I've sold 44 books, and everyone's, sort of nicely sort of patting me on my head and go, oh, that's great. And that's a pretty cover. And nobody said a single bad thing to me. And
Right.
then the next month I was like, a lot more. And then by June I made $2,000.
Mhm.
So all of a sudden, for 2 books. So all of a sudden I had credibility behind me.
Right.
I could start saying to people, do this, and this is what it is. And I was talking to people, and I was blogging about it, which I haven't done for years, but
Right.
whatever I was learning, I was telling. And I was even able to say to, like, for example, one of the women she'd been a Harlequin author for many, many years. And she had this great contract for 5 books, and her advance was like 100,000, and everyone was so in awe of that. Except she had, for book number 5, she had the editor from hell, a new
Mhm.
editor, and who had was just abusive and had just devastated her, and she stopped writing.
Mhm.
And so I was saying to her, so at one of our parties after our meeting, I went up to her and I said, Mindy, this is your chance to do it yourself. This is your chance to start writing again. This is your chance to heal from what this person did to you, and to be able to find the joy of writing your own stories your way, and picking your own editor and working with your own editor who's going to be supportive, and doing your own covers and all of these things. And she started, and now she's very successful as a self-published author. But it helped the part of me that's a psychotherapist to go, hey, if you haven't been successful, if you've been hitting walls, here's doors. Here's doors to open. And if you need
It's
healing,
yeah.
here's ways to help you heal
Mhm.
your wounded heart.
Yeah, and that I will say that. So I remember. So I joined RWA in 2006, I think, and I did. It was hard to hear because on one hand, there's this like golden ticket that you're trying to like grab for, and then you
Mm-hmm.
get it. And I will say this. So like the second book that was traditionally published, the editor had left or she had passed me on to somebody new. I don't remember which, maybe both.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure. And then the new editor didn't like me. You know what I mean? It's like, here, I got your book and I don't like it. And
But
it
this
was
is
hard.
a story too.
And
Happens all the time.
but I'd already signed the contract and I was slotted for whatever the date was. You know what I mean? So at that point, you're like,
That's
she was
life
hate,
too.
she was hate editing and I was hate revising and, you know, and so it wasn't, but even with that experience, making that leap to self-publishing was conceptually difficult. Maybe if I'd been younger, like that also may have helped. But I had grown up in a traditional publishing era in a traditional publishing city. My friends from college got jobs in traditional publishing. It was such a huge thing in my head. So I guess I want to ask you this because you were one of the earliest adopters that I know, not one of the earliest adopters on earth. But what made you take the leap into self-publishing when the many of the rest of us were standing around conferences hoping that like Harlequin or Source Books or whatever was, gonna give us the ticket.
Well, it's going to go back to what I said earlier about writer friends, and to give a little backstory. Wild Montana Sky, which was my first book, won the Golden Heart, the RWA Romance Writers of America Golden Heart in 2001. And from that, I had an agent who shopped it around to all the traditional publishers. And the feedback was like, good book, doesn't fit the market, because it was historical, it was Western, and both of those genres in that time were not popular.
Right.
And it was sweet as opposed to, meaning it wasn't sexy. So like Little House on the Prairie. And I would debate with editors when I went to conferences and things like that. And they're like, and I would say, I think there's still plenty of Western/prairie readers out there. I think there's plenty of people who want the not sexy books. Some because they don't like sexy books at all, and others because they don't care. They just like a good romance. It doesn't matter how much sex or how little sex you have in it. And they say, yeah, that's true. That may be true, but how do we find these people? And and Amazon, with their keywords and categories and things like that, they made that possible. So after then, I had another. So my agent then got sick and sort of gave up. And I also had a fantasy series, which had been a finalist in the Golden Heart Conference. And that group, so that was in 2003. So that group of authors, we became very close, and we decided to start our own like e-zine. So we would, every month we would publish a magazine, e-form magazine on writing and things like that. And we called ourselves the Wet Noodle Posse, meaning like we want to whip each other with a wet noodle to sort of stay focused and write. And, it was a very positive kind of connotation. So we stayed together and became very good friends, and are friends to this day. And at some point in 2000, so I then I had a new agent, another round for both the fantasy and the historical, and same thing. Both didn't fit the market. My fantasy had too much romance for fantasy, and too much fantasy to be a paranormal romance.
Right.
So then in 2010, and I really wish I had listened the first time, one of my Wet Noodle Posse members, Del Jacobs, emailed us, the group, and said that she was self-publishing. And I didn't pay any attention to it. So this was like the summer of 2010. And then a few months later, I actually got my first book contract. It was for a nonfiction book called The Essential Guide to Grief and Grieving. While I was writing it, it was my book from hell, because it was the company, the publisher was the Complete Idiots Guides publisher. And and so they had the essential guides were for much more sensitive topics that you could not put idiots in the title for. Gotcha. And so they had their very own standard of writing, and they would want a chapter, a sample chapter, and then they would want a very detailed outline of the whole book. And so I decided to pick my hardest chapter, which was the death of a child. And I usually work with adults, so I had to go out seeking parents who'd lost and interview parents who'd lost their children. And it was a very emotionally difficult one to write, because every single parent cried. Didn't matter how long ago the child had died. And so I wrote my chapter, and I wrote my outline, I sent it off, and then my editor sends it back. So anyway, it was this long process of jumping through their hoops. And at one point they had said to me, and that chapter, then when it was done with my editor, he sent it to the committee, and the committee sent it back and said, it's got the wrong tone. We want a lighter tone. And I'm like, I had a meltdown. I'm crying to my boyfriend at the time going, it's the death of a child. How can I have a lighter tone? And I went online to one of my writing groups and complained. And again, this is where having writer friends helps. Because one of them who, Lex Valentine, I don't know if you know her from our chapter, actually works at a mortuary cemetery. And she wrote me back and she said, they want you to give people hope. And I'm like, that I can do. Totally saved my book. So I'm in the middle of the book from hell, and then Del writes our group again and says, I'm making $3,000 a month on my self-published books. And I was like, if you hear me pounding the table, I'm like, I want to make $3,000 a month on my self-published books. And as soon as I'm done with this book from hell, I am going to self-publish Wild Montana Sky and Starry Montana Sky. And in the meantime, my other groups, because we'd all had several, at least several books that we'd been writing for years. So
Right.
they also got excited about that, and they immediately started self-publishing. And so I was like 6 weeks behind them.
Mm-hmm.
And I worked with Dell. She created my covers. And, I had been thinking of covers and dreaming of my cover for many years. So I knew what I wanted. And she created it for me. And inadvertently, we didn't know it at the time, but we were branding me and my covers.
That's true.
So, me being a technophobe person, I'm like, if I hadn't been in that group of people, I probably wouldn't have done it, even if I had known, because it would have been too intimidated. But they were just like going, Deborah, do this. Step 1, step 2, do this, do this, do this, do this. So I just followed in their footsteps. They'd made the mistakes already, so they could tell me, don't do this, or don't do that, or do this. And I put the book up. And within a year, the book no one wanted, Wild Montana Sky, was a USA Today best-selling book.
Mm-hmm.
And part of it was I hit 2 underserved niches in the market, which were the sweet Western prairie that New York wasn't publishing, and so readers really were craving them, and they found my books, and off they went. And then in the summer, I published the fantasies. Surprisingly enough, to me anyway, at the time, was they didn't do as well. Mm-hmm. They've more than paid for themselves. They've earned more money than I probably would have if I had a traditional publisher. They just haven't done as well.
All right. So I'll ask you this question, which I think I've always wondered, not keeping me up at night, wondered why did you end up writing about Montana and the prairie? I know you've traveled there, but I don't know if that's subsequent to writing the books or before.
A little of both. How it came about was this was 1998. I was at a New Year's dance party at a cowboy dance place in Orange County, which is no longer there. So I met a young cowboy, and we hit it off and had a lot of fun. And, young cowboys in Orange County, California are pretty rare.
Yes, but okay, sorry.
So he had been working for the races. And so we started going out and had a lot of fun, but had nothing in common. And so I started thinking about, like, if we lived 100 years ago in the West, who he is and who I am just might work. So that's how the story came to me. Sort of had this vision of this man and woman in period dress riding horses along a creek. And I started writing the book. And my young cowboy moved on. And when the racing season ended, he had to sort of follow the racetrack off. And he went, and we lost touch.
Right.
Me through Facebook, like many, many years later. I'm like, Mike, you have no clue. You've changed my life.
Oh my gosh, like that's okay. I have no story like that. So when you were young, did you read either Westerns, which were popular when I was much younger? My grandmother had a lot of them. Like, in New York, you could buy them back then at newsstands when you were for your train ride. Let me just say that. So she had a lot of them like laying around the house. But did you read Westerns or historicals when you were younger?
I read historicals, some Westerns like Zane Grey and things like that. So I read everything. I outread the library, the town library, the school library. I read what books were way too old for me to read, and
so many.
But I did love Little House on the Prairie. I loved the Little House on the Prairie books. I loved the Little House on the Prairie series, television series, and so that is sort of the flavor of my books, where the town is sort of like its own character. Mm-hmm. And that over time, the different people in the town have gotten their own stories too. So
this is so interesting because so when I was a kid, I read all the Laura Ingalls Wilder books, but, and so when I was a kid, I used to do dishes. This is We had a dishwasher and then we didn't. I don't know though. There was an interim where there was no dishwasher, and so I had to do the dishes as one of my chores. But I would talk to Laura Ingalls Wilder like in my head because she was such a fully formed person who had all these thoughts and feelings. More so, maybe it's because it was one of the first series I'd read that developed, as opposed to series, that like Sweet Valley High, where there's really no character development.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but I never. There's so many books that I read, but I've never wanted to write I mean, I've never wanted to write anything like that. Did it feel like, I'm going to ask you this because this is one of the reasons I wouldn't do it. Did it feel like a lot to tackle a historical period? Because I mean, I went to school and all that, but I don't have a comprehensive knowledge of the 1800s. I mean, I really just don't.
Yeah, well, yes and no. I mean, I had started the writing part that had interested me. Growing up, my grandmother, she was German. She had been from a wealthy family in Germany and had been a very wild child when she was a kid. And, when she wasn't in boarding school, she was running wild over their estate and getting in all kinds of trouble. Like she had one year, like the gypsies would come through every year at a certain time, and the word would go out through the neighborhood, the gypsies are here, lock up your livestock and keep your children at home, and all those things. And my grandma, of course, sneaks out and rides she's 14, she sneaks out, she rides her bike to the gypsy encampment.
Oh my God.
And, she described it as they had the wagon and they were sitting around a fire and with a violin playing what she called melancholy music. And one old lady came up to her and couldn't speak English, but was like trying to tell her that she wanted to like tell her fortune. She couldn't speak English very well. And my grandma was like, but I don't have any money, because she wanted money. I was like, I don't have any money. Pointed to this necklace, which she had just gotten from her aunt for her confirmation. And my grandma took it off and gave it to her.
Oh my gosh.
And so her fortune was that she would marry a dark guy with, dark hair and eyes. And she would, go over the ocean and she would live in a big house, and her fortune came true. So, but my grandmother made it because she ran away from her family to the U.S. when she was 19. So she made it happen. So I was going to write about my grandma. I was going to write her stories, and I was collecting her stories. And I was like, okay, when I'm done with school, I will write about my grandma. Well, except I was in school forever. I have a master's degree, I have a PhD. I went to USC, so it was expensive. So I'd not be able to take a full load because I'd have to work. And, my parents paid for my bachelor's, but then it was up to me for the rest. Mm-hmm. So it took me forever. And then I had to do the state license. And by then after that, I had to collapse and go, oh, I'm not going to do anything for like a year. It took me for a while to go, oh, okay, I'm ready to write. But by that time, grandma's really old. Doesn't remember a lot of the details I would have needed to actually write a story of her life. So I just took my favorite of her stories, like the gypsy story. And I wrote short stories about all of them. And that's how I got into writing. And that's how I got into writing fiction, because school was all about writing nonfiction. Mm-hmm. So that started me learning to write. And somehow I was at the LA Times Festival of Books, and I met somebody who told me about RWA. And I thought, oh, that sounded interesting. And so I joined, and then I found some at RWA. Somebody told me about Luella Nelson, who became my writing teacher, editor. She's been my editor all these years, edited all my novels. So again, you can sort of see this progression is meeting people, meeting other writers who give me advice, point me in directions. And that's where I'm going. And then, after that, that's when I got the idea for the Ron Montez guy, and I started that direction.
Okay. I have another question, because I'm thinking about this now, because the story you're telling is not dissimilar to many other writers I know. But of course, not all the writers, but let's say 95% of the writers I know I met through RWA. Do you think that if it hadn't been RWA specifically, that you may have written something other than romance?
I might have, because I liked science fiction and fantasy a lot. too. And so that's why I was also writing, as I was writing Wild and Starry, I was also writing Sower of Dreams, which is the first of my fantasy series,
Right.
and Reaper of Dreams. And so I had the two books in each, and I also had started a contemporary. So maybe, the science fiction fantasy organization was never very open, especially in those days, was not really open to new writers, didn't have all the resources and help and support that RWA did.
This
And,
is true.
and it was also a lot of old guys,
Mm-hmm.
judgmental
Yeah.
guys, So I don't know that I would have actually succeeded if I had gone a different direction than romance.
That's so true. Oh my God, you're really making me think about this because I don't know if you did this, but initially when I decided, I don't know, like really decided that I was going to write as opposed to like, I've been writing my whole life, but you know what I mean? Like decided I was going to do more than like a few freelance articles here and there, which is the kind of thing I did. When I finally decided I was really going to like sit down and do it, I joined a number of different writing groups. I remember them, both on the East Coast and here, and it never gelled for me. And I think that's when I was working on my first legal thriller, which is, it's a whole story. It took forever, agent, publisher, nobody wanted it, whatever, the same story. But I put it aside and wrote two romances. So like a lot of writers, and I'm sure you've had this experience, I read everything all the time. I enjoyed romance a lot, but I read a lot of them because there were a lot of them. Like when you went to the library, there were 10 romances, and one of the buzzy book of the moment. So I read a lot of women's fiction as a kid. I'd read the one women's fiction, and then I'd be like, well, I got 10, I got more days in my life. So I'd read 10 romances. So they had a great influence on me, and I really did. I love them as a kid. I still like them. But I think that joining like the romance community after making an effort to join other more generic, like let's say it's literary or crime or whatever communities, were not as warm, welcoming, helpful, and didn't have that huge cache of knowledge, because I don't know if I would have been successful in getting an agent. Not that the agent didn't get published. I had to run around with the agent, similar to you. That never worked out. But whether getting an agent or eventually like self-submitting as far as romance you could do, getting published, I would have done without that helping hand. Like if there had been an organization, I don't know, of crime writers that was similar, I wonder if I would ever have written romance, or would it just been the thing I read. But you're really making me think of that, because so many people I know, so many writers started in romance, some continue, but people do, I don't want to say branch out, it's not a different thing, but people often move to whether it's women's fiction or some other thing. And
like a subgenre, like romantic suspense.
Right. Yes. Yes. It becomes more, a lot of people I know have niched down, whether that's a good marketing branding strategy, or just because that's where their interest took them. It's a different conversation. But I do wonder if all of us would have written so much romance if the community hadn't been there. And I do wish, and people ask me this all the time, writers that I meet who don't write romance are looking for a community similar to the romance community, but in different genres. And nobody's been able to find it, create it, or, and it's interesting and sad. I don't know why that is, but it doesn't seem to exist in other genres in that same way.
Well, I think because RWA is mostly female, and that as women, we tend to be more collaborative. And men, okay, we're talking about psychotherapy right now, psychotherapists, and the male and female brain is different in some respects. And so, like the men and their worldview tends to be much more hierarchical. Who's at the top and trying to get to the top and squish the people below you down. And that's very general when I say that. So don't really specifically, but women tend to be much more collaborative. And so the idea of, what is said in RWA is, I don't know if it's actually written down slogan, but it was said so many times. It's like, one hand reaching up, one hand reaching back, you're
right.
You have
Yeah.
somebody who's above you, who's helping you, and you, someone who's below you, who's you're helping. And it was a
Mm.
very strongly worded message of this is how we do it. Others help
Mm.
us and we help others.
Right.
And I don't know that most groups have that philosophy. They're like, okay, it's like every person from themselves. And that doesn't mean you don't get advice and learning and help from other groups too. That it was very much made a priority in RWA.
I do think that's true. I mean, that is my experience. I don't have a particularly negative, I mean, no, people do, but I don't have a particularly negative experience in the romance community. When I joined, people were super helpful. Like, it is super helpful, like you should submit to this publisher or you should talk to this person or whatever. And that played out. And or similar to you with the audiobooks, like it was good advice. I took the advice. I passed on the advice to other people who were like, well, how did you do that? I'm like, this is exactly how you do it. You call X, you do Y, you log in here, whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I always say to people, I'm not hiding or bogarting the information. You want it, I'll tell you.
Mm-hmm.
And it's great, but I wonder if it influence what we wrote. And that's okay. That's a thought I'm going to have for another time. So the other question I have,
probably too, because romance publishers were much more able to buy books. Harlequin was buying lots of books. So it's like if you're wanting to break in and have a platform to then springboard to something else, romance was actually the better place to be.
That's true. I mean, if they were publishing hundreds of books a month, I mean, and they, I don't know what it is now, but they were, then they had the capacity to accept you.
Right.
And mold or shape you depending on how you feel about all of that. But it was a place to get published and get that experience initially. And I mean, I've had good editors, bad editors, whatever. That's a whole different conversation, but I don't have any regrets about that because it really helped me have confidence to move forward and think, well, if I can write these books and publish them, then I can do other things. I can write other genres, other books, publish other way. It gave me the confidence to sort of move forward. Yeah.
And I think too, with the self-publishing, it's like a lot of times our readers will follow us, not always, depending if you jump really big jumps with genre, but if you sort of do subgenres or like if you put romance in your thrillers, your readers might follow, or a lot of your readers might follow you. So it's easier now to sort of keep some of your readership.
Mm-hmm. That's true. That's true. And also the eternal shelf.
I don't know.
Okay. So I have this other question. So you're only one of two writers I know who also are psychotherapists. And how, okay, well, let me ask you this. I'll go back. What made you want to be a therapist? Because it's one of the things, how there's jobs you consider and there's jobs you never consider. It's one of those jobs I never considered. It's like, you want to be an astronaut? I'm like, no. You want to be a psychotherapist? I'm like, there's never. I mean, there's a ton of other jobs. I'm like, oh, maybe I could do that. This is not one I ever considered. So how did you develop an interest in humans?
This goes back to my grandma again. I would spend a lot of time with her, and she had a subscription to Ladies Home Journal, and they had this very, very long running column called "Can This Marriage Be Saved?" And it would have the wife's point of view of the problems, it would have the husband's point of view of the problem, and then it would have the counselor's part of how he or she was able to help them work through things and bring them together and help them have a better marriage. And I was fascinated by that, and I knew like around 13 that I wanted to do that when I grew up. So, as the same age and the same sort of, with my grandma, it's like, okay, there's these two things, writing and, being a counselor. So I had both of those. Just for school, to be a counselor, you have to do school.
Right.
Writing, you don't have to do school. So that's why I did that one first.
Wait, so what did you major in undergrad?
Psychology.
Oh, you did? Okay.
Psychology, then the master's degree is in marriage and family counseling, and then the PhD is in counseling psychology.
Okay. Do you know Grace Calloway? Because that's the other person.
Yeah.
Okay. And the two of you, the only two. I mean, there's a lot of lawyers and a lot of other people, other professions, but the two of you are unique.
Mhm.
In that, do you, so she quit. I don't know if you know this, like years ago, at this point, years ago. She was down to 1 day a week and then she ultimately quit, but you kept going. Cause I remember you used to come up to, the Valley. I want to say once a week. I don't know. I feel like it was Friday, but maybe that's just my memory. Um, to do what made you keep your hand in the counseling?
Well, I was actually West LA where my office was,
Mm-hmm.
and I was working like 2 or 3 days a week there.
Mm-hmm.
And I also was doing some coaching. And so a major studio had sent one of their difficult lawyers to me. He was in trouble for different reasons.
Mm-hmm.
And so they wanted me to coach him so that he could, like start getting to work on time and things like that. So he was actually doing better. We were, going on, and he also had a psychiatrist. And then he did something really stupid at work and got fired. And his psychiatrist was out of town. And so all of a sudden he goes off the deep end and starts, I'm on the phone with him for hours. It's like, no, you're not going to, you're not going to commit suicide, all this stuff.
Right.
And it was like, so burning out. And at the same time, I'm mad because I'm like, okay, you've just messed up. And then he goes, I'm going to sue them, which he did. I'm like, oh, great. You've just ruined my relationship with this studio, this big, huge studio, which he had. I'm like, I'm never going to get clients from them again, which I didn't. And I was like, for the first time ever in my career, my long time career as a counselor, I was like, I don't want to do this anymore.
Mm.
At the same time, this is when my books were taking off.
Okay.
And suddenly I had the luxury of being able to choose because I wasn't limited by finances to doing what I had known before. So I cut back considerably to like 1 day a week. And luckily when he was like my client, when his lawyer said, you need to stop seeing her because she's going to feed the studio anything you say to him. And I said to him, like, no, I'm not. I can't. It's confidential. I wouldn't do that. But if your lawyer says you can't see me, you have to listen to your lawyer. So I got rid of him, thank God. So then I'm just mostly doing the writing, and at that point, I'm not doing. I'm doing the corporate crisis and grief counseling as well, just not as much of it as I have been doing lately. And so I started having sort of this existential question in my mind because I know my purpose for being on this planet is to be a healer and to help people heal on an emotional, mental way and make their lives better. And I'm like, okay, am I living my purpose? Because by writing romance novels. And then I got an email from a reader who said, your books helped me deal with the death of my only son.
Mm-hmm.
And I wrote her back and I went, do you mean my grief book? She said, no, your novels. They led me to your grief book because in your bio, it talks about that. But it was your novels that have kept me going. And it was like this sign from God that said, whatever you do, you will be you. And this healing part of you will come out. And I relaxed. And I went, okay. And with soon after too, with not doing as much counseling, my love for it came back. So I didn't stay burned out. And so I've been doing both or all three. I've kept it small. I don't try to do anything to try to get new clients. People will refer to me from time to time, but I've kept a small psychotherapy population. I've kept doing the corporate crisis and grief counseling, which I accelerated doing a lot of that during COVID because there were so many people dying and so many people just having mental health crises. So I haven't been writing as much the last 3 years, and I've been doing a lot more counseling.
So I'll ask you this because I always wondered this: why crisis and grief? Because those are so acute. it's like being in, in like an emergency room position. That's such a, people, the people, when people have an acute need, it's such a, I think it can be overwhelming. But what is it that made you continue to do that that practice?
Because I make a difference and I'm really good at what I do. It helps to have done it for so many years that over the years I've really learned what works and what doesn't work. Mm-hmm. And so I visibly see people change in front of me. That doesn't mean they're any less grief stricken. They're just much more centered. They're much more knowledgeable. They're much more able to connect what has happened to whatever wounds that they have in the past or whatever situations they have going on in the present. And so I can see the shift in people from when I talk to them. Now it's exhausting work.
That's the part that seems hard. Like like I had a friend who quit emergency medicine to do like cardiology. I'm not lying. Like, just like a left turn because it was so overwhelming. I'll say that.
Well, first of all, I don't do it every day, right. So it can be like, for example, this week and last week. So I had a company that had an industrial accident where an employee was killed. So I was there Thursday, Friday, and then there was Labor Day weekend. And then so I was there Tuesday and then Wednesday. And it was an hour commute and I had to be there at 6 a.m.
Oh my God.
For that shift that everything happened. But the first day that I was there, I talked the manager of the company into doing a management group. And the way that I do that is by saying, hey, there's ways to manage people who are grieving and traumatized. So they think that they're going to come to my group and learn about how to help their employees, but it's also about them. Mm-hmm. And so he's like, okay, I'm fine. I don't need it. But if you say it's going to help us help our people, then of course we'll get all the managers and supervisors in. And so by the end of the group, he was like my number one fan. He was like, this was so helpful. I learned so much. And then he starts asking me questions about his wife and goes, what, because you talked about communicating in this way. And what do I do if I see that to her and she does, and so he's asking more questions. And then they start sending everybody in. And so they, the guys especially would come in like sort of, and their arms are crossed in front of them. Not necessarily physically, but that's I don't do this, but he wanted me to come. And then by the end of me talking to them, they'd go, oh, this was so helpful. I'm really glad I came. I didn't think it would help, but it has helped. And off they go. And so watching that sort of turnaround and watching people who would never go talk to a counselor and go, oh, this is helpful. Oh, I've learned things, not just about grief, but about myself. Or I've learned some things I can now generalize beyond this incident and I could use it in other places as well. So
that's such an interesting way to meet people who would otherwise not seek out mental. Okay. That's amazing. Yeah. That's amazing. Because you get to touch people who might not get up one day and go, I need some therapy.
Yeah. And I tend to be, most counselors just sort of do this sort of surface level grief kind of stuff. I tend to go deeper. And it's one of my abilities to be able to tune into people and sort of really know what they need. And so I'm able to go something like they're talking to me, I go, okay, so you're sensitive, right? And I like from one sensitive person to another, this is one of the reasons you're having this kind of thing. And so then we start talking about sensitivity and how it plays out in their life and how it can be a strength and it can be a weakness. And these are the ways to be a strength. And these are ways it gets in our way. And how can we then use it in a different way than they've been using it and not see it as weak and bad, but it's actually a strength if they do it this way. So off we go. And so I've given them this gift that they can now use for the rest of their lives in their hour or so that they spent with me.
Okay. I really like that. I like that. I don't like what would have to lead you to the crisis counseling, but I like what you can give people who otherwise might not come in. That's fascinating. Mm-hmm. That is, I really like that. So one thing you just said that I'm going to like that snagged was you were saying that sometimes grief can open triggers and old wounds. So, I mean, I've been in therapy. I'm still in therapy. And I know that wounds and other things can affect how you react, respond, live, make
Mm-hmm.
choices in your life. But I never thought about grief triggering that. But is that a thing that can sort of, I never thought about grief sort of opening old wounds. I actually never, wow. Okay. I'm going to have to think about it.
Mm-hmm.
Is that a thing? Because I only think about triggers, opening old wounds, or people, pouring salt into that like one area that you're just like, could you?
I mean, grief is a trigger. That event is a trigger, and a lot of times it is. People have losses in the past that can come up for them, or they could put themselves in the position of the family. Maybe they're a parent and they've got a troubled child, and they have fears that this child is going to do something crazy one of these days, and then here they have a suicide at work, and now they're it's having to confront their worst fears as a parent. And so we have a chance to talk about some parenting skill things, but also, there's so many fallacies about grief. And one of them, and I would throw these words out the window if I could with people, is be strong. And so I give this lecture to everybody all the time, because we tell people who are grieving to be strong. And what I say to people is, crying, having feelings doesn't make you weak. It makes you sad. And that you can be a strong person, and in your strength, you can be vulnerable. And sometimes it takes a very strong person to be vulnerable to other people and to share their emotions. So just reframing for people how they label themselves and other people, and that it's okay to not have to be so strict with yourself about how you should be or shouldn't be, and what you should and shouldn't feel. Or like people will say, well, I didn't really know him, but I'm so upset. And they're like, something's wrong with me because I didn't know this person who died.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm having these emotions. I'm like saying, of course, a human being who you worked with, even if you didn't know him very well, has died. And in this case, this last week was in this tragic way. Mm-hmm. I would be more worried about you if you weren't upset.
Oh, this is okay. Wow. Okay. You're making me rethink grief, because what I think about grief, and I've not had too many occasions to have grief. So these people seem my family live forever, but I've always thought about grief as a thing that's perhaps everlasting, and that you learn to live with, along with living with all your other crap. But
which is true. That is true.
But there is that whole, I don't know, I sometimes wonder if this is an American thing. There's this whole stoicism around grief, like, suck it up, be strong, whatever the phrasing is, and it always feels like grief has a time limit. And it's like, well, you should be over that by now. It's been 2 months, 2 years, 2 days, 2 minutes, whatever it is. It always feels like there needs to be some end date. And the only thing I've read about grief is that there is no end date, but it may not be as acute. I mean, like, my grandmother died when I was, 40, you know what I mean? So she'd been around my whole life. And the grief is not as acute, and I still sometimes get sad, but it's not.
And you miss her. You still miss her.
I do, because there's nobody. Okay, she was born in 1920, so clearly she can't live forever, but there's nobody to have those conversations with about that time in history, which I've had tons with her. Mm-hmm. That kind of thing goes away. And the person who had that sort of institutional knowledge, she was the oldest in her family, is gone. Mm-hmm. And so I do miss that, and it's not as acute, but I've never felt, well, I don't think I talk about grief with other people. But I don't think I've felt bad about grieving, but I know people do feel bad about grieving, and I'm not sure why.
Because we have this belief that grief has to look a certain way, and people are uncomfortable with other people's grief because it's one of the only things in life that we really can't fix or help with in any way. We cannot, we are powerless to bring back the person who's died. Mm-hmm. And we have, therefore, so few words of comfort. And the words we do have are like are not helpful. So we grope for whatever we've heard. That's the cliche that we're supposed to say at these times, like be strong, as if being strong and going through life without emotions is the way to handle it. or to say you have to move on or you have to get over it. And people are well-intentioned when they say those things. However, those things are not helpful. They're actually just the opposite. And so what I have to tell people is to say, it's not about what you say. It's about how you present yourself. It's about actually listening. It's about not trying to move them on from their emotions, but being there with them in emotions and making it safe for them to go, I know this is like the 50th day that I'm coming to you and crying about my husband dying. And you're like, it's okay. You can, if it's 100 days, you can still come and cry to me. It's okay. And I'm just going to listen and be there. I'm not going to try to fix you or shut you up or tell you he or she's in a better place, which, by the way, you can only say to somebody if they're older and they've had a long drawn out dying, like from cancer. You can really genuinely feel that he or she's in a better place. But somebody who's younger or somebody who's died suddenly, that's not helpful, because you're like, so he or she's in heaven having a party with Jesus, but I'm down here with the pain. I don't want them in heaven in the better place for another 50 years. And it's not that I don't want them in heaven or not comforted a little bit by that, but it's too soon for them to be here. And I'm here with my pain. And so saying he or she's in a better place is usually not very helpful.
But you're saying this and you make me realize that people are judgmental about grief, because they either think, at least in my experience, they either think that you have grieved too long or you have grieved too briefly. And especially this is around, like, I know parents whose spouse has died and who has, whether they've remarried or gotten into a relationship, and people have a lot of feelings about that. But it's very interesting that I guess people must have their own perception of what grief should look like. And when people don't meet that standard, there's some incongruity there that rubs people the wrong way.
Right. Exactly. And that it's really important not to judge, and that if somebody has found comfort in a new relationship, and, maybe it is rushed, but they're going to find that out on their own. And so if it brings them comfort, why not be supportive? If you've got some specific red flags about the person, then that's a different conversation.
Right.
And I think too, that idea that grief should have a certain time, and often for, like, losing a spouse, for example, often it's the 7-8 month point to a year that we actually go deeper into grief, because some of the numbness has worn off, even though you've known that even though you've been sad, even though you've been crying, even though you've been doing all the grieving, it becomes more real later on. And it can become more acute. And at the same time, people then are starting to give you messages of, you need to be moving on. And so it's very crazy making.
Yes.
And so I tell people all the time, second year's often harder than the first. And for more, like I say, spouses and stuff. Kids, it's going to be just, it's like 10 years before you sort of start to actually, 5-10 years to sort of start to come to some kind of acceptance of how your life is. That doesn't mean you stop grieving. You don't. And so it's that idea of, it's going to take as long as it takes. And instead of judging you or trying to hurry you on your grief so I feel better.
Right.
I'm going to let you be there. And if I truly feel like you're stuck and it's like, okay, it's been 4 years and you're still crying every day for your husband, then it's like, okay, you need to go see a grief counselor.
Oh, this is so interesting. So I'll ask you this, because I will ask you, do you write about grief in your books, or would you consider, okay, romances are all over the place, so I'm not going to box it, or do you consider that not a hopeful enough message, I guess, for
No, books? I do. And it's totally one of my themes, and that especially because my books are set in the 1880s and 1890s. And the world was a very different place. For all of human history, people died. And you lost children. You had lots of children because there was no birth control. Right. And you would, at least by the 1880s, 1890s, you would lose one or two of them. Early on in history, you'd lose half, or, a plague could come along and you could lose all of them. So, or women died in childbirth, and a man could get a cut on his arm and, it gets infected and he dies. So people died. You lived with all these multiple losses. And that was just how life was. There was no such saying of, oh, parents shouldn't outlive their children. That's a modern saying. So in my books, I usually have, and sometimes it's backstory, and sometimes it happens in the book, but there's a loss that the hero or heroine or both are having to sort of move through and process. And a lot of times it's finding love after loss. And so that's a theme for me.
Mm-hmm. What other kinds of themes do you write about? So I'll say this. Several years ago, someone asked me, what common themes do you think your books have, or what are your books saying? Now, at the time they asked me, I was like, they're each individual, and they have nothing in common. This is not true. I now know what my books are saying, and I got it. Mm-hmm. But I did not have that self-awareness around that, let's say 5 years ago or 7 years ago or something like that. What themes other than, let's say, grief, loss, or healing, what other themes do you think you have in your book, and why?
I think the other theme I have often is, now it's not an overt theme. It's very subtle. Right. It's often part of just sort of the plot or the person's progression, but the relationship with God. And so it could be fantasy gods in my fantasies. And it's not like my books aren't / inspirational under that category, but they do go to church. They do occasionally pray. They do have that relationship on some level with God. And one of my books is more inspirational because the hero is a minister, but it's that idea of having a relationship with a higher power or higher source that is sustaining and important. And what can happen if you don't have that or lose that is also a theme.
That's interesting. So why do you think you've turned to that as a theme? Because my themes are so different. But I now know, after some reflection, that they sort of come from my beliefs as a child about humanity and people and behavior. So I get that now. I didn't get it earlier. But what do you think has possessed you to sort of have that as a theme, or as an enduring?
Well, I think it comes from my own relationship with God or the universe, however you want to conceptualize it, which is a very much underpinning of my life and a sort of sense of sustenance and support to me. And so it's just sort of something that's there. I might not, I tend to go through stages of, I haven't been going to church the last few years because I've been too tired to get up in the morning to go to my favorite service. They held the service at 5 p.m. I would go, but but that doesn't mean that doesn't affect my relationship, and it's just sort of given and one I too often take for granted. But I tend to stay very aware of gratitude and spiritual gratitude and blessings, and which is also, by the way, very good for your brain, because gratitude helps light up our brain in very positive ways and pulls us out of anxiety and fear and stress. So it's a good place to be living from in a general sense, which is also part of why I like writing my books, because there's so many things that we just take for granted in our lives. And I like to pick, not every book, but in many books, I'll pick something that I draw out more to just illustrate the differences. Like in one book, it's doing laundry and what it's like to haul in water and to have these heavy clothes and to have to scrub on the scrub board and to wring them all out and to then go hang them up and and it's like you read that and go, oh my God, thank God I'm so grateful for my washing machine and my dryer. Oh. And then I have a storm come and all the clothes are on the line, and, so it's that kind of, let's be grateful. Let's read these historicals and feel grateful for all the things we take for granted.
I say this as the air conditioning comes on. There are many things I really appreciate. So I have this other question I've thought of from time to time because you're one of the few people I know who write sweet. How can I say this? Um, how are you not influenced to write less sweet romances? Because, I mean, I don't know if this is your experience, but my perception of the romance genre over time is that it's gotten sexier and sexier
Mm-hmm.
and that sexier books sell. I don't know because my level of heat is the same, so I can't I can't speak as to what, and I don't know all the statistics. I don't work at Amazon, but like what how have you not, I don't want to say gone down that path, but what made you not change the way you write given that the way the genre has shifted?
Well, I'm not one of those people who reads romance for the sex scenes.
Mm-hmm.
And if it were up to me, I would like to severely limit them in other people's books because a lot of times I just skip over them. Sometimes if I feel, because a lot of times I just feel gratuitous, but sometimes the kind of ones I like are really woven into the plot and into the characters and into their emotional and mental journey. And when an author can convey that and add that through the sex scenes, that's what I really like that. The rest of the time I'm like, yeah, I know about sex. Let's move on to the plot. Let's get back to the interesting stuff in my world. And then sometimes too, it's like, oh my God, the scene is going on and on and on and on and on. Can we please get the rest of the book is so fascinating. Can we get back to the interesting things?
Mm-hmm.
We don't need 12 pages of a sex scene. But this is this particular author I'm thinking of, very big author. Her books are very successful. And if I were to have this conversation with me, she would say, well, my readers like that. And I would say, but I'm one of your readers and I don't like that. And I would really like to be curious about what would happen if you would write a book that's still your book and still your style and chop your sex season down to 4 pages. Would that really affect your readership? Would they drop off? Would that, if you wrote a series and that was it, would you maybe increase your readership? What would happen? And it's unfortunately, we can't really have those kind of scientific experiments with our books because there's so much work to write a book, and you do jeopardize your readership if you write something enough that's different enough. That I would really like that scientific experiment of what happens when you try, and could it maybe be not what you're afraid of? Could it maybe have the opposite reaction to it? But yeah, I could just as soon do a lot less or read a lot less. Plus, sex scenes are hard to write. The couple times I've had to, it's like, when I was writing my contemporary that was supposed to be more sexy, I would start keeping a list of like sex words, because like how can, I'd be reading authors' books and I go, oh, that's a word, or that's like a phrase. And I would write it down because I'm like, we have to find creative ways to talk about the same things that are happening. And how do I make it fresh?
That's interesting. I have a book called the Book of Filth on my writing shelf that I used to use for that. But actually I don't write. It's fascinating because I actually like sex in books, but it's the way you're talking about it. So, and I've had this conversation. I think Beth did a class on this years ago. That, how can I say this? What we all know is that if the sex is well integrated into the plot and you learn something about them or they learn something about themselves, then that's like the gold standard. But I don't, and this is the question, I don't know. I'm not the right reader. Like, as my son always says, you're not your reader. And I get that because I'll read anything. I read widely. I have a lot of different tastes. I don't know. And the experiment you do, I do wonder. I don't know what other readers are reading for. Like, I know what I'm looking for in a book, but I have discovered that other people are looking for something different in a book.
Right.
And maybe we can both get it out of the same book. Maybe we can't.
Right.
But it's too hard to know. And it's interesting because I've never written a romance without sex, so I don't know if I could do that. Like, I'd really have to think about that deeply, but I do like my legal thrillers actually don't have sex. And it's fine writing it, but I feel like if I wrote a romance without sex, my book would be 4 pages. And it's not that I don't have like, well, I don't know. I'd have to really think about the spice level. I know how I write sex. I don't think it's a lot. Maybe. I don't know. I'd have to really, really think about it. But I don't, to me, I don't know. I have to think about whether I've read, let me say this, I'm babbling. I have read some really great romances that are just sexual tension. And I'm like, this is even some recently. Actually, Robin Beelman does a really good job with that. Mm-hmm. And I'm just like, this is amazing. I wish more books could ratchet up this tension, because what I'm looking for is the tension. But in a lot of books, I feel like you have to pay off because the tension is not enough. So you have to have some kind of payoff for like to see the relationship development and evolution. Mm-hmm. But I don't.
Yeah, and I like it when it comes later in the book too. It's like, okay, it's not halfway through or a third of the way through we have our obligatory sex scene, but
right.
It's like, let's see what the relationship is. And I think that goes back to my counselor self too, which is I tell women all the time, don't jump into having sex with somebody, and that's the sort of the hookup culture or the quickly having sex when you're trying to date somebody. The problem with that for women is that we have this bonding chemical called oxytocin, which gets released. And so I say to people, don't bond. You don't want to bond with somebody until you know what their character is like. And so wait, get to know this guy more, get to see if he has feelings for you and you have feelings for him, because you do bond, and that you give away little pieces or big pieces, it depends, of your heart. And don't do that to yourself, just wait. And so it bothers me when there's like really quick to have sex, when it's not motivated. Again, I can see it again if it's like a second chance where they're coming back and they used to be high school sweethearts or something. But
right,
it's like, and for the same too, the reason of that really dominant alpha male. It's like, I wish women wouldn't write that, and yes, on some level, it's the female fantasy of the protective male who loves you, who won't hurt you. But a lot of times these guys are so controlling that I'm like, this is a bad standard. This isn't love. And that you can take it in a romance because you can make the guy protective and loving and supportive and he would never hurt you. But in real life, guys who are that controlling, that's abusive, and it can get worse. And so I think it's a very bad precedent. We're teaching women some really bad messages.
Oh my God. So I have a question because, so I agree with you, but I feel like my older self agrees with you. My 20-year-old self would be like, how about sex in the world? You know what I'm saying? But like now, so I have I have the gift of hindsight. You know how that is. Mm-hmm. And looking back and seeing how that is. But I do wonder, so I lived through the Bruising, Punishing Kisses books. But I do sometimes read, like, especially when New Adult was very popular, let's say, I don't know, 5, 7, 10 years ago. I don't know. And I was like, so he's given her a computer and he's taken her phone, but she can only use like his phone. And I'm thinking, oh my God, like you can't do that. Like that is completely unacceptable behavior. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Like, or he's whatever those like alpha male controlling behaviors are like, that's not on.
Right. And if that was real life, I'd be saying to her, run.
I know, run. What do we need? Do you need a safe house? What can we do? Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
But and this is something I've not parsed this out in my head. So some books I just don't read. I don't know. Okay. Since our understanding of relationships has evolved and there's a lot more literature and information, God knows there's YouTube available now about what constitutes healthy versus unhealthy relationships. I do wonder what people make of books that don't portray them as healthy. Is it a fantasy, or are you sort of reading, like I read books for drama that would like drama that I would never have in my own life. Well, you cheated and you did this and you did that. And I'm like fascinated, but I can never live that way. So I don't know if people are reading it like I read from a voyeuristic point of view. I know people, not everybody does, but I just want to know what other people are doing, but I don't want to live it. Like I'm not that interested in it personally.
Right.
So I read from a voyeuristic point of view, so I can like put it down and go, those people are nuts. And then you shove the book and you go live your life. But I don't know if other people are reading, like looking for examples of love or things like that. And I do wonder how it affects them. But I would like to think that the other influences of their life, family, whatever that is, society, have more influence than the controlling guy in a book. But I honestly don't know. And I feel like with all the things we talk about with influences, I don't know the extent to which those things give people an impression of how things, quote unquote, should be.
Well, I think that especially if they haven't grown up with different kinds of fathers who are much more nurturing, and that it's very much presented, this is what love is. And in a book, it's safe because the guy is going to have some boundaries and is going to be loving you and isn't going to be trying to limit you from like living your life and living to your full potential.
Right.
He might not want you to do something particularly dangerous or whatever, but generally he's going to be there to enhance your life and to encourage you to fly, even as he's being protective and stuff like that and controlling. But in real life, that is rare. In real life, the guy is insecure and he does his controlling, and he's when you first date it might be a few things like, oh, don't dress like that because I don't want my friends to, if we go out, I don't want other men looking at it. So that's sort of sexy, oh, he loves me, he doesn't want other guys. But that's only the start.
Right.
He's going to start narrowing your circle. He's going to have friends that he disapproves of, and he's going to have you stop seeing those ones, or family that he disapproves of. And little by little, he narrows his control, and he starts to put you down and criticize you and make you smaller, because that's how he can control you. And that's what reality is. And so it's very easy to sort of go into it going, oh, he's giving me all this attention and he's giving me all this love and gifts and protectiveness. And it's very easy to go, wait a minute, there in books it goes one way, in real life it tends to go the other.
Yes, that's true. They're completely incongruent. I'm really going to think about this, because when you read the psychological thrillers, the ones that have been popular in the last few years, they narrow the control, and the woman's stuck in the house and she's trying to get out of the house. I've read too many of those. And I'm like, I don't know how your world narrowed so much that you can't even leave your own house, or you're in the basement, or you're in the woods, or whatever. But that's, psychological thrillers.
And they might have jobs, but like I was talking to one, when I was there for a grief counseling kind of thing, I was talking to one of the women, and she was saying, I have to leave now because I have to, my husband knows when I get off work, he knows exactly how long it takes for me to get home. And he expects me home on the dot pretty much at that time. So if I keep talking to you, I'm going to be late and I'm going to be in trouble. And then I'm going, here, read this book.
I know. Let me slip you this pamphlet. It's interesting, because I think as an adult, and now I realize this, there are a lot more people in controlling relationships than I think what I would have thought existed as a child. And reading romance, where men were more controlling generally. And now as an adult, so much hindsight, as an adult, I'm like, God, no, I think I went on a date post-divorce with some guy who was like, I think you're flirting with a waiter. And I'm like, oh my God, because I asked him if he had shrimp on a Monday. Like, you know what I mean? And you're like, that's a no. You can't know my phone number and address. So you know what I mean? So as an older person, it is so much easier for me to see that, but it takes life experience for that. And if I had, I don't know, like if I had, let me say this, in my 20s, I won't say I was looking for romance, because I knew to some degree it was a fantasy, but also you still wanted that person, but the behaviors were not healthy. And it was really hard as like a 25-year-old or whatever, 18 to 25, I'll say this, to parse out the difference between like loving behavior and the crazy making behavior, because initially they look the same, not exactly the same, but you know what I mean? It's hard as a young person to parse that out. And I don't know if I had read different kinds of books, I would have thought differently, because you're, at least in my life experience is so limited. You only know like your parents and like 10 people, you know, and to
And
see
exactly, like use your example that you just used, Sylvie, with that guy at the
mm-hmm.
date, and maybe you smile at the waiter, and as you're giving him asking about shrimp or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
and so then he says, "Oh, you're flirting," and then what usually happens is women will go, "No, no, I wasn't flirting. It was blah, 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 blah," and they explain themselves, and like you were going, "That's the red flag. I am out of here," and you're absolutely right. But many women won't be able to do that. They'll instead try to explain or justify their behavior, and it's just going to be the start.
No, so my 25-year-old self probably would, but I think my 45-year-old self looked at him and I thought, okay, the waiter was, I remember this distinctly because that's the first time it ever happened to me. The waiter was like some 25-year-old kid, and I ordered something and he had explained to me the fish truck didn't show up, right? And I was like, does that mean fish or does that mean like shrimp, or, because shrimp is sometimes frozen and I was willing to eat that, whatever. And that's all I had asked him, but he was cute. He's 25 or something. And I don't like to be an asshole. So I was like, kind in my questioning, like, okay, if I can't have these 10 things on the menu, can I have this 11th thing, before I'm that diner? And the guy, I don't even know what I ate. I have no recollection of what I ate. I just remember him saying, "Oh, you're very flirty with the waiter." And I thought, because I was kind? And it was just so weird. And I thought, but I don't know you that well. And I don't think my behavior was that way. And he said it again when we were leaving. And I was like, this is super interesting. But I don't want to, I have no more conversation for you. Like it was super interesting. And it wasn't, did I see it as a red flag? I just wanted to know why he was so fixated on I wasn't dating the waiter. I was never going to date the waiter. I'm not calling the waiter afterwards. Like, you know what I mean? Like,
right. See, that would be the explanations parts, like, I'm not interested in the waiter. He's young, blah, 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 blah. As opposed to going, something's wrong with you that you would judge me as flirting when I wasn't, and that you would hold on to it to bring it up again. And I can see this is going to be the start of me having to defend myself all the time and never being able to look or talk to another guy. I am out of here and you need help.
It turns out it was projection, because during dinner he was like, yeah, my wife left me because I cheated on her like 5 times. I was like, okay, yeah, you were looking at the waiter. Okay. That's very interesting. I'm gonna go home now and read a book, because that's way more interesting.
Yeah. Book boyfriend.
It's just, yeah. No, I've had not great post-divorce dating luck, because there's a lot of people out there who seem to would love to control me, and I'm like, not really today.
Yeah.
It's actually fascinating, and I have a lot of thoughts about meeting those kinds of people, or whatever it is. Dating apps I don't recommend for anybody anymore ever, for this reason, because you meet people outside of your circle who behave in ways that I've never met people to behave that way. So I'm just like, this is a fascinating group of people I don't need to know any more about. Like, I was just like, okay, yeah, the fact that we have no people in common is probably not a good thing. Because then it allows people to behave in all sorts of ways, which is, I've read many books on it. It's sort of fascinating, but I'm done in that sense. But I do wonder about the influence of books, because, and I'm an only child, so I did not have like siblings to run around and play with. So I did read a lot as entertainment, like as, I don't want to say as, they weren't my friends, like books were my friends. I had friends, but it was something I could do when there was nobody else to talk to. And but books did have an influence to some extent, because it was the only way I could learn how people behaved in a broader sense beyond the people in your life. You've talked to more people than I do in this way. Do you think that that fiction, at least, has an influence on people and their beliefs about human behavior?
I think it can. It also depends on what kind of fiction that you're reading. And I think that, one of the things I see in articles or interviews all the time, especially with people of color or other kind of, maybe it's about religion, or maybe it's like if you're Jewish or something, it's like, I finally see myself in this show or this book, and I finally see people like me, and that there's something about that is so precious and important to them. And so, yes, I think too that just the opposite, being excluded from stories of whatever medium, and to go, okay, I now feel part of this story. Or a lot of people maybe can project and go, okay, I can understand where this character is coming from, even if their outsides don't match my outsides, but their insides match.
Right.
I think that there's a tremendous comfort too in seeing yourself in some way, or seeing characters overcome things that gives you hope that you can overcome things too. So, and I think romance reminds us to love what's possible, and remembering the time when we were falling in love with whoever our partner is. And so I think there's some, there's way more I read romance every day, even if it's maybe not every day, because someday I'm reading fantasies or science fiction or whatever, but all the time, several times a week, let's say. But I think that, paying attention to what you're reading to and why is important.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay. Yeah, I will. That's interesting, because I don't know how people choose books. And so that's, if I knew, I would run the world. So that's interesting. I don't know. People choose them for all sorts of reasons. What are you reading right now?
What am I reading right now? Let's see. I gotta remember. I'm reading one that is sort of a fantasy, like medieval kind of fantasy kind of book. I'm going to pull up my Kindle right now. I've got several books going. Okay, so
yeah, I know we all do. It's the nature of the beast.
Last night I read a supernatural suspense and read that one. And I've also been reading the Black Fall series by Carla Nagers. So that's thriller.
Oh, yeah.
Kind of thing. So, and then I have a Regency going too.
Wow. Okay. I think I'm on a different path. No, I'm reading actually a book now. I'm thinking about it. Called Dark Corners. I was listening to it this morning. I read it. I now have a thing. I love the library for this. I get the audio and the Kindle at the same time, and so then I listen to it while I'm cooking or biking or whatever. That's what I was doing yesterday. Or then I read at night. Read. I mean, read a book. But I'm reading now just a murder mystery. But I'm fascinated by the idea that she's a podcaster, and I'm like, I like the idea of true crime podcasts, but I don't listen to them generally because true crime is not my thing. But I do like reading fiction books about true crime podcasters. So that's like the thing I'm into currently. It's a little like niche thing. I'm like, oh, and a new one came out, and I was like, gonna read this. But it's always interesting. I want to thank you so much for doing this interview today. It's fascinating. I'm actually going to think way more about grief. You actually made me think about grief in a different way. And you did remind me about how helpful romance writers have been, you yourself and others. And I think it's the most wonderful thing about that community, or this community, or the community, as it were. But I do want to thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me and my listeners today about writing and life. And
it was my pleasure.
It was
you and I could talk all day.
I know.
Sorry,
I know.
But
I know we've closed down a restaurant or two. So, but thank you so much. And as always, for my listeners, if you have the chance, I will include all of Debra Holland's stuff in the show notes. But do take the time to read her. She sells millions of books to people, and they're well loved. Anyway, Debra Holland, thank you so much.
You're welcome. You take care.
You
Bye.
too. This has been A Time to Thrill with me, your host, Aime Austin. If you enjoyed today's episode, I hope you'll share, rate, and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. It will help others to find and enjoy my conversations with brilliant women creators. Also, please hit the subscribe button on your podcast app. In addition to hosting this podcast, I am also the author of the Nicole Long series of legal thrillers. The first 3 books in the Nicole Long series are now live. You can download Outcry Witness, Major Crimes, and Without Consent to your e-reader right now. The 4th book in the new series, The Murders Began, is available for pre-order wherever you get your books. I am also the author of the Casey Quit series of legal thrillers. These titles are available wherever books are sold, your local library, and also an audiobook. You can also find this podcast on Facebook at A Time to Thrill. Thanks for listening, and I'll be back with you soon with more great conversation.